So now that the dust has settled following last week's very hectic end of session, we have a chance to assess what really got done over the past 6 months. Of course, that was Governor Cuomo's first experience with the notoriously dysfunctional legislature. Now, much has been made of Andrew Cuomo's big-ticket accomplishments. And now the folks at NYPIRG are providing another means of measuring the 2011 legislative session. They have put together a report on how many bills were actually introduced in each house, how many were passed, who sponsored what, and how members voted. Here to parse the numbers and help us put them all into context is NYPIRG's Bill Mahoney. Bill, it's great to see you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank goodness for you and your spreadsheet capability, or we would all be in serious trouble, at the LCA at any rate. So we should say up front, though, that this is all about just numbers. This isn't an endorsement, an assessment of which bills were better, which bills were worse, just numbers, right?
Correct. Yeah, we've done a lot of things like ranking legislators by the number of bills that got passed. And those are helpful numbers to know when judging how successful a legislator was, but they're definitely not the whole picture.
Right. Well, I mean, some things are sort of not controversial and no-brainers. Things that we thought, for example, might not be controversial turn out to be controversial, like the vegetable debate, the onion versus sweet corn debate. But this is interesting also. In terms of sheer numbers, it actually wasn't the most productive session when you look at just bills that got passed. I actually think that we have some numbers on this. Let's pop it up there. Okay. This is bill passage totals: 999 by the Assembly, 1,289 by the Senate, 677 both. That's actually underneath the average.
Yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of focus this year on the big ticket issues rather than some of the smaller problems that the legislature traditionally tackled. I'm not going to say if that's good or bad. They certainly had much more success in these big ticket issues than they've had in any session going back decades, probably. But as you mentioned, in terms of the overall number of bills, they were slightly below historical averages.
Yeah. Do you think that I mean, sometimes bills are introduced for symbolic reasons, for political reasons, to help a particular constituency? I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got people here, for example, who didn't introduce anything at all, like Bill Boyland,
yes.
But he's also facing corruption charges.
Correct,
so
yeah.
Perhaps he's got his mind elsewhere. But Assemblyman Dov Hikind also one bill. Just
yeah.
one.
Yeah, and some of these people who don't introduce a lot of bills, they may have been busy working on other bills. Some of the people who didn't get a lot passed focused heavily on just one issue. Assemblyman O'Donnell, for example, was towards the bottom of the pack for Assembly Democrats with relatively similar tenures in Albany. And he only got 5 bills passed, I believe, but one of those was probably the most hotly contested issue going back years and years, which was the gay marriage bill.
Right.
So he put a lot more effort into those 5 bills than some legislators who may have passed 20.
Right. I mean, that there are bills, something like that, for example, that's so controversial that it takes up a lot of time. I mean,
yes,
it's not just that you pass a bill. Well, you might introduce a bill and do 0, and it might just sit there and might go through committee because it's not controversial, or it's a local issue that no one contests, right? Or you might have to whip votes, which actually takes quite a bit of time.
Yeah. A lot of the people we saw passed several bills, but they were all focused just on their constituencies or specific members who live in their district.
Right. So in terms of the most success that we saw, that belongs to Campaign, that actual tag.
Yes, yeah. He's a Senate Republican from Nassau who's been around for several decades now, and he's also the chair of the Health Committee, which handled a significant amount of legislation this year. So
right.
He led the pack in terms of overall number of bills that were passed.
Yeah, this is actually pretty interesting because Campaign was a very busy guy, actually, this year, because he was involved in the same-sex marriage negotiations along with Senator Saland and Senator Lanza, and then at the very end, Senator Grisanti. So he must not have been getting a lot of sleep.
Yeah, he also played a big role in a few of the other issues, like the healthcare exchanges, which haven't passed yet, but I'm
right.
sure he spent a significant amount of time working out the details on that.
You know, we don't have. You just saw the numbers on what we were discussing there in terms of who had the most bills that passed both houses. Again, we should remind people, obviously, that it's got to pass both houses and then subsequently get signed into law by the governor, right?
Yes.
That's how bills become laws. It's interesting to me here, when you look at the number of bills that majority versus minority members managed to pass in the Senate, the Democrats actually fared not as well as the Republicans did when the Democrats controlled the House. I find that a little bit surprising. Why is that? Do we know?
Well, one of the reasons might be simply that the Republicans, for political calculations, decided to not let Democrats pass as many bills as the Democrats did when they were in charge. Another might be the fact that Republican senators, on average, have been in Albany longer than these Democratic senators. and thus they have more experience stepping into the leadership role in terms of what needs to be done to get a bill passed, and they've written more bills over the decades that are waiting to be voted on.
Right. I mean, we're talking about, you're talking about Democrats had bills passing the Senate at 103 bills, is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, compared to 1,081 bills for the Republicans.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a vast disparity. I mean, it just basically goes to show you exactly how much majority matters when you're talking about Albany.
Yeah, and pretty much all the bills that the Democrats did get managed to pass were the local bills we've mentioned, things like renaming certain stretches of highway or providing a pension fund relief to a specific constituent who lives in one of these districts. The Democrats were definitely not the sponsors of many of the big bills that we saw passed this session.
Yeah, but we should also mention, too, that it's sort of a time-honored tradition in Albany that the majority poaches good bills from the minority. So it's hard to know, actually, that things that some of these majority members actually passed might have originated on the minority side. That happens a lot in the Assembly in particular.
Sure, yeah, there's nothing to stop a majority legislator from taking the exact language that a minority legislator introduced in a bill and introducing that as his own and then seeing it pass on the floor within a couple months.
Yeah, I also just want to talk about bills, program bills. What we're talking about here is a bill that originates from the governor's office.
Yes.
Actually, Governor Cuomo sent up quite a few.
Yeah, he introduced 45 total this year, and that number includes duplicates for one in the Assembly and one in the Senate. So the actual number of program bills he introduced was approximately 23. And he got 16 of those passed by both houses of the legislature. Now, there were a couple other program bills, such as a Power New York one that got wrapped into the budget, so his success rate was actually closer to 80 or 90%.
That's high.
Yeah, much higher than any previous governor. Previous governors have introduced sometimes hundreds of bills and seen similar numbers passed, kind of gone with a scattershot approach. Well, he seemed to have his priorities, and with only one or two major exceptions, got all of them passed through the legislature.
The difference here, though, is there's a little bit of a caveat, which is that David Paterson had a lot of program bills because so many of them were actually connected to the budget.
David Paterson managed to pass 43 or 44 last year, and he did need to pass a number of budget extenders. And 2 years ago, he introduced over 600. And that was due to the fact that the legislature, as you probably remember, specifically the Senate, was stuck in special session for a month.
I do remember that, yes.
And each time they gavelled in, he would need to reintroduce every program bill he had, so his numbers were artificially increased quite a bit.
And the other thing that Governor Cuomo did not do, although he did fall back on this towards the end, was messages of necessity. And this, to remind viewers, actually enables the legislature to circumvent the 3-day aging period for legislation.
Yes, yeah. Oftentimes these are introduced when major deals are not decided until the last minute, right before the legislator either needs to go home for the session or pass a budget on time. And it seems like this year, with a couple of notable exceptions towards the end of session, most of the major deals were reached several weeks before they were actually voted on, so there wasn't a lot of urgentness needed. This was a more well-planned out session in terms of that than previous years have been. Yeah,
I just want to mention, unfortunately we're out of time, but I just want to very quickly touch on this. In terms of Albany being a leadership-dominated culture, I mean, the average Democratic Assemblyman or woman, for example, voted with Speaker Silver 97.41% of the time. That's high. The people who actually were the most contrarian, quote-unquote, are down in the high 80s. That's not exactly breaking with the leader.
Yeah, most of these bills are very non-controversial, and few people will vote against something, naming a local highway after a veteran or something along those lines. So a lot of the bulk of these 677 bills that we saw were things of minimal importance, even though many of the big issues like gay marriage and the property tax cap got most of the attention. They did spend countless hours passing these bills that certainly affected some people, but not as many as the big ticket ones.
I just want to tell viewers to head on over to our blog, State of Politics, actually, if you want to take a look at this. It's there in full. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mahoney, it's good to see you.
Thanks.